1.45 billion euros. Seriously, just let that number kind of sink in for a second. That is the staggering mountain-sized debt that FC Barcelona, literally one of the most successful, glamorous, and widely supported sports institutions on the entire planet, found themselves completely buried under. I mean, we're not talking about some minor accounting error here. We are talking about a catastrophic financial collapse that brought a global sporting empire right to the absolute brink of total ruin.
You know, it's a reality that almost seems impossible when you really think about it. This is a club that was consistently generating close to €1 billion in revenue. They had the biggest stadium in Europe, the most lucrative sponsorships, and, oh yeah, the greatest player to ever touch a football. So what does this all mean? How exactly did the world's richest club go functionally bankrupt? How do you even lose that much money? And more importantly, how on earth do you even begin to survive it?
I am so incredibly excited to unpack this for you today. In this explainer, we're going to break down the sheer hubris, the devastating external shocks, and the absolutely dramatic financial gymnastics it took to save this legendary institution. We'll be looking at exactly where all that money went, how the crisis hit its peak, and the totally unprecedented, high-stakes gamble the club took to try and rise from the ashes.
Okay, let's dive into Act 1, Hubris and the Pandemic. Because to really understand the recovery, we first have to understand the disease.
Now, this wasn't a crisis that just happened overnight, right? It was a slow-motion buildup of reckless decisions. The fuse was really lit in the summer of 2017. Paris Saint-Germain triggered Neymar's record-shattering €222 million release clause. Suddenly, Barca had a literal mountain of cash, and every selling club in Europe knew it. But instead of investing that windfall wisely, the club panicked. They went on this crazy, reckless buying spree. I mean, $148 million on Ousmane Dembélé, $145 million on Felipe Coutinho, and $120 million on Antoine Griezmann. That's almost €500 million on three players who, let's be honest, fundamentally failed to replace Neymar's impact. But the real damage wasn't just those massive transfer fees, it was the giant contracts handed out to these guys. That artificially bloated the club's amortizations, basically meaning spreading those massive transfer fees over the length of the contracts, and it just completely shattered their wage structure.
And then, well, the music stopped. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, stadiums obviously emptied out. Now, I want to be super clear here. The pandemic was absolutely not the sole cause of Barcelona's crisis, but it was the brutal catalyst that exposed all the financial rot underneath. Matchday revenues just fell off a cliff, dropping from nearly €175 million down to a mere €23.7 million. When you're living that wildly beyond your means, relying on constant cash flow just to pay those exorbitant wages, a drop like this hits a death sentence. The cash flow dried up, but unfortunately, those massive player contracts did not.
Which brings us to Act 2, the breaking point. This is where the club enters the darkest period in its modern history.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what went wrong. By 2021, the short-term debts had piled up, revenue was severely depressed, and the math simply broke. In Spain, La Liga enforces these incredibly strict financial fair play rules, setting a salary cap that's based directly on a club's revenue. The recommended limit is about 70%. Barcelona's wage bill had ballooned to an unbelievable 103% of their total income. Think about that. They were spending more on players' salaries alone than the entire club was generating in revenue. This direct collision with La Liga's financial rules resulted in something we've basically never seen. Barcelona was handed a negative spending limit of minus €144 million, meaning legally they were totally paralyzed. They literally couldn't register new players.
The problem was glaringly obvious. The roster was heavily reliant on an aging core. Guys well into their 30s like Piqué, Busquets, Alba, Suarez, and Rakitic. Now, don't get me wrong, these guys are absolute club legends for sure, but they were sitting on massive legacy contracts that were no longer matching their depreciating economic value or, frankly, their on-pitch performance. It was like a giant puzzle they couldn't solve, a squad incredibly expensive to maintain but virtually impossible to sell for any sort of profit.
And that exact mathematical impossibility led to the ultimate tragedy for Barca fans. When Joan Laporta returned as president in 2021, his #1 goal was keeping Lionel Messi. Messi even agreed to a staggering 50% pay cut to make it work. But because of those strict La Liga salary caps and the bloated squad, the math simply did not add up. Actually, there was just no way around it. The club had to issue this heartbreaking statement citing financial and structural obstacles. They couldn't register the contract. For the first time ever, Barcelona was forced to prioritize the bare survival of the institution over keeping its greatest icon. And just like that, Messi left for Paris.
All right, let's move into Act 3, the gamble and rebirth.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they responded. The loss of Messi was the ultimate wake-up call. The club was technically bankrupt with a completely bloated wage bill, so survival required a highly controversial strategy, the infamous economic levers. Because they had zero cash, Barcelona decided to sell pieces of their future to fund their present. They sold 25% of their domestic La Liga TV rights for the next 25 years to an investment firm. They sold 49% of their in-house media company, Barça Studios. This injected hundreds of millions of euros into the club immediately. It was essentially emergency oxygen. It allowed them to wipe out their short-term debts and, miraculously, go out and sign world-class players like Robert Lewandowski and Jules Koundé just to keep the team competitive.
So the crucial point here is understanding why they had to do this. Unlike Chelsea or PSG, FC Barcelona is a member-owned club. It's a socio model owned entirely by its fans. They don't have a billionaire sugar daddy or a nation-state backing them to just swoop in, write a massive check, and clear the debt. By law, they cannot receive arbitrary cash injections from owners. Therefore, to fully restore their equity and satisfy UEFA and La Liga regulations, monetizing their non-sport assets, pulling those levers, was legally and financially, well, pretty much the only way out.
But hey, the levers only bought them time, right? They didn't fix the underlying disease. That required some brutal wage surgery. Over the next 2 years, the club systematically dismantled that bloated wage structure. Legends like Gerard Piqué, Sergio Busquets, and Jordi Alba departed, some of them even forgiving millions in deferred wages to help the club. Higher-earning, underperforming assets like Dembélé and Griezmann were successfully moved off the books. And the result? The wage bill plummeted from that catastrophic 103% all the way down to a super healthy 54% of revenue, putting them comfortably within UEFA's recommended limits.
Let's move to and see how this builds on the pitch, because you can't just cut your way to success in football. You still have to actually win matches. Since they couldn't just casually afford €100 million transfer fees anymore, Barcelona turned back to their roots, La Masia, their famed youth academy. Players like Lamine Yamal, Gavi, Pau Cubarsí, and Alejandro Balde stepped right up into the first team. And why does this matter so much financially? Because they cost €0 in transfer fees. They carry zero amortization costs on the balance sheet, and they start on very reasonable academy-level wages. This generation of homegrown talent has completely changed the economics of the club's rebuild. It's a real game changer.
At the exact same time, they had to secure their future earning potential. The Espai Barça project, which is the massive ground-up renovation of the Spotify Camp Nou, carried its own €1.45 billion price tag. To manage this without totally crippling their fragile daily operations, the club successfully refinanced the specific stadium debt, pushing the major repayment deadlines all the way back to 2050. It's a very calculated risk. Endure the short-term pain of playing in a smaller Olympic stadium right now in order to unlock massive world-leading matchday revenues when the newly renovated 105,000-seat Super Stadium finally opens.
And get this, the early indicators suggest this massive, multi-front gamble is actually paying off. For the 2024-2025 season, Barcelona reported a record operating income of €994 million. Sponsorships are up, merchandising is absolutely booming, the wage bill is finally under control, and the club has finally returned to La Liga's normal one-to-one spending rule. That means they're no longer operating under those strict emergency financial restrictions. They literally took themselves out of the intensive care unit.
But as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a critical thought. Yes, the net debt is shrinking, but hundreds of millions are still owed. A quarter of their domestic TV revenue is just gone for the next 2 decades. The levers absolutely saved the club from bankruptcy, but they came with an incredibly heavy mortgage. So looking at this miraculous €1.45 billion turnaround, we have to ask ourselves, did Jean Laporta's economic levers truly secure Barcelona's long-term future, or did they simply rent the present? I'll let you be the judge of that.